The final piece when we're talking about politics before and after the internet is a term that really comes out of Yochai Benkler's work, the idea of the public sphere. The public sphere is a set of practices that members of society use to communicate about matters they understand to be of public concern and that potentially require collective action or recognition. In other words, this is a social communications process. During most of American political history, up until the internet, you have a platform of the public sphere essentially dominated by mass media. That could be print, that could be radio, that could be television, but it was essentially dominated by these mass media sources. And that's really important because regardless of whether you're talking about newspapers or radio or television, before the internet you essentially have this model. You have what is referred to as a one-to-many model, and that is with one main source and many potential audience members. So the source-to-audience relationship was a one-to-many one. And that was based on a number of different factors: the technical architecture and the economic structure of this whole system. The technical architecture was, in many ways, was referred to as a hub and spoke model. The hub being the media source, the radio station, the television station, the newspaper that is being printed, and there are a very small number of these hubs with production facilities that create enough content for a lot of different people to actually receive. That's sort of the basic technical architecture. The economic structure is extremely important here. There were very few sources of information for one really important reason. It was extremely expensive to create content. The high-cost hubs of information were important because it limited the number of people who could actually create information that would be disseminated, both for politics and for other purposes. But it was extremely cheap, or relatively cheap, to receive the information. So you could have a very passive audience that became the mass audience that ultimately was receiving newspapers and radio and ultimately television itself, but they really couldn't create the information themselves. Some good examples of this would be the cost of the printing press. The cost of the printing press, it started out as a very local, very small process, but the cost of printing skyrocketed based on both increased printing technology and more expensive printing technology, and also the cost of professional journalists as we moved from a more partisan press into a more objective journalistic profession of who was actually being hired to write for these newspapers. And so what you ended up having was more and more expensive content to actually create, with the goal of trying to keep the actual end product very affordable. The result is what you see here, which is that the New York Times weekday cover price, when adjusted for inflation, from the very beginning of its creation in 1851, stayed very, very affordable. It was part of what was called the penny press. In 1851, the New York Times was sold on street corners for 1 penny, and when adjusted for inflation, that was 26 cents. But what is pretty remarkable when you look at this chart is that the price of the New York Times, one of the most respected newspapers in the entire world, stayed below $1 all the way up until 2002, when those numbers started to skyrocket. So from 1851 to 2002, when adjusted for inflation, the price was very, very affordable, and a lot of people could use it, even though the cost of creating the New York Times and hiring all of those professional journalists and the technology involved in printing those millions of copies of newspapers every day were very high. The cost remained very, very low. All of this starts to change with the internet, because with the internet you shift from what was referred to as the public sphere into the networked public sphere. And the network public sphere has an altered architecture and economic structure. And that's extremely important when you think about how this affects political news and political communication. The networked public sphere doesn't look like a one-to-many process. It looks like this. It looks like a multi-nodal network where a number of different people or organizations can create political content, can create any content that they wish. And so more and more people can participate in the public sphere. The barriers to create content, to share content, are at least reduced, if not eliminated. And we're going to see that as an important factor in what we talk about throughout most of the rest of this course. The economic structure is limited, or is changed dramatically, because anyone with internet access can now create content. You can create free blogs, you can create free websites, you can ultimately be the source of good information without needing to buy a radio station or buy a television network. This multiple source, many-to-many system does a number of things, but it also really makes it less clear where the point of control is. If it used to be with the major television networks or radio networks before them, major newspapers, now we know that information can flow freely regardless of what that source is. It's not just the sources of political news, the traditional sources of political news, that really have those points of control. So for politicians and political organizers, it also makes it more difficult to rely on those traditional news sources as a way to manipulate and modify coverage and content, but it offers new opportunities for those political actors to actually create information themselves, something we'll need to explore more. All engaged citizens, regardless of political ideology, regardless of economic background for the most part, can participate. We can participate through very passive things like forwarding things on through social media, or we can write our own opinions, write our own blogs, actually take an active role in creating petitions online, things like that. The economic structure and the technical architecture have changed, and this networked public sphere is really the digital political landscape that we are going to be living in for the foreseeable future.